As we've seen, we can use secondary dominant chords to heighten the harmonic sophistication as we're moving towards diatonic triads. In this video, we'll talk about how we can also use them to move towards diatonic seventh chords using the example that we've got in front of us here. So what we'll do is take the secondary dominant we have, a 5-7 of 5, which of course leads to a 5 chord, and we're going to instead lead it to a 5-7 chord. But before we do, let's just listen to it in its current form. So the way I arrived at the 5 chord at the end, of course, was again through going through the secondary dominant. That allowed me to have some ascending chromatic activity in the alto here, proceeding by half step on the way up to its F sharp. Similar situation in the tenor. It starts a half step ascent, but then it goes ahead and resolves down. So I end up with a tripled root in the 5 chord, which is what makes it incomplete. So while this is a perfectly good example of using a 5-7 of 5, right, in this minor key here, we can actually take the 5-7 and resolve it to a 5-7 chord within the key of B minor, right, within our original key. And in fact, doing so isn't really complicated at all. In fact, it's really just a difference of this one note here, having this E sharp resolved differently. Now, the reason this is notable is that the E sharp is working as a temporary leading tone with respect to the F sharp major chord that it's on the way to. But instead of having that leading tone resolve upward, we're actually going to have it resolve downward by half a step, which is a little bit of a departure. Actually, it's quite a departure from the way we've talked about leading tones up until now, right? We've said that generally leading tones will resolve up, and if they don't resolve up, it's okay to frustrate them if they're in the inner voice by resolving it down to the 5th of the target chord. Well, here we're going to resolve it down, but just by half step. So watch here. We'll take the E down a half step to E natural here, right? And of course, if we just look in the abstract, just looking at this chord, yeah, it spells a really well constructed incomplete 5-7 chord. We have a doubled root, we have the 3rd, we have the chordal 7th, and of course it's incomplete because we're missing the chordal 5th. But by now we're used to the idea of being able to omit those as needed. But again, what's happening is this temporary leading tone is actually resolved down by half step. When it's working within a secondary dominant, we can actually get away with that. And as long as we're resolving to a 5-7 anyway, we may as well go ahead and finish it off and resolve to a 1 chord, just like that. So let's take a listen to this now. So again, this gives us a relatively simple example of how a 5-7 chord acting as a secondary dominant can arrive at a version of its target chord that is itself a 7th chord. But now I want to show how we can do this using just a plain old 5 chord, right? So we'll reconstruct this without the 5-7 of 5. So here we have it then, a 5 triad of 5, right? Going to now a complete 5-7 chord, and this one then resolves to an incomplete 1 chord. So here's how I made this a 5 chord rather than a 5-7. Well, the chordal 7th here was a B, which I had held in the soprano, but since I'm no longer doing a 7th, I went ahead and allowed the soprano to move up to a C sharp, which now doubles the root. Okay, so I've got a very classic major triad here with a doubled root, a 5th here, a 3rd here, okay? And that root here actually is allowed now to carry over as a common tone, giving us the 5th of the 5-7 chord, which is what makes it now a complete chord, okay? So now, as we've already learned, a complete 5-7 will tend to resolve to an incomplete 1, and I've done that here, right? Notice how the tenor now has the leading tone going up to the B. Okay, the bass resolves down to the B, so now I have a doubled root, okay? And then the alto does the same thing it did before, it resolves down to the D, but the C sharp resolving down to a B in the soprano means that I now have a tripled root. One really neat feature about this particular progression happens to be in the tenor, right, which has some very interesting, a lot of chromatic motion here, right, and it's all ascending upward. So we have chromatic motion, of course, from the F sharp to the G to become part of the 4 chord in the tenor, and then the G moves up by half step to a G sharp, right, to become part of the 5 of 5, which is what the tenor did before, but now it's allowed to continue its ascent into the leading tone, this time moving by a whole step, which really kind of gives us almost a sense of that melodic minor motion, and then that leading tone then resolves, of course, up to the tonic there. One more notable aspect I just want to briefly touch upon is that what I've done in this progression is I've actually created a bit of a sequential pattern here. If you look at the 1 chord and how it goes down a fifth, or up a fourth rather, to the 4 chord, that kind of harmonic motion is repeated in the next pair of chords, where I have the 5 of 5 chord, which, accounting for the chromatics, is basically a step above the 1 chord. Again, so the chromatics kind of mess with that, especially in the alto, but really it's a step above, and it also goes down a fifth or up a fourth to resolve to the 5/7. So as I play the progression here, listen for that pattern work as well.